radiocarbon dating and dating the age of the Earth. So there's radiocarbon dating, but the more accurate term is radiometric dating. So I'm going to read to you briefly from Wikipedia. Radiometric dating. Radiometric dating or radioactive dating is a technique used to date materials such as rocks or carbon, in which trace radioactive impurities were selectively incorporated when they formed. The method compares the abundance of a naturally occurring radioactive isotope within the material to the abundance of its decay products, which form at a known constant rate of decay. The use of radiometric dating was first published in 1907 by Bertram Boltwood and is now the principal source of information about the absolute age of rocks and other geological features, including the age of the Earth itself, and can be used to date a wide range of natural and man-made materials. This is absolutely untrue. It does a terrible job of dating anything, and well, you'll see as we get to it, the accuracy of it is debatable at best, and completely inaccurate and unreliable in reality. So there are different methods of radiometric dating, which vary in the timescale over which they are accurate and the materials to which they can be applied. This is their mainstream scheme, that they have these different versions that they're refining to get different types of accuracy about different types of date scales. But you'll see that their date scale is so ludicrously off that it makes the entire project null and void to begin with, because they base it on their heliocentric model to begin with. Their expectations are way off. Now, why I'm bringing this up, that there is another method of dating the Earth which is much more accurate, and it is the polonium radio halo. So we're going to get a little bit into that, and I'm going to show you why we know for sure that it is real, that it worked, that it proved the original age of the Earth to be young, and I'm going to show you how science colluded to make sure that nobody ever heard of it, and that creationism and even the possibility of Earth being formed in that way was kept out of the mainstream and out of schools and out of the public eye, and was laughed at and refuted, that it was a conspiracy, that there was collusion on the part of the state to cover up this evidence.
And indeed, here at Dinosaur National Monument in Vernal, Utah, we see a giant fossil dinosaur graveyard. The time has come to draw some conclusions about the age of the dinosaurs and the age of the fossil fish found at Fossil Butte National Monument. Here at Dinosaur National Monument, there's a sign that says these dinosaur bones are 145 million years old, the so-called Jurassic era. But we know that can't really be true at all. Remembering our early results on the colified wood, there we found the collapse of geologic time. The Eocene, the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and the Triassic, we found were all together only several thousand years ago. The fossil fish in the Eocene, the dinosaurs in the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and the Triassic, all again collapsed to just several thousand years ago, buried at the time of the worldwide flood.
This evidence disputes the whole evolutionary theory of life's origin and development. But some may ask, hasn't science proven dinosaurs lived hundreds of millions of years ago? It's just the opposite, according to the new evidence described by Dr. Andrew Snelling of the Creation Science Foundation of Australia.
This May 1995 issue of the journal Science has a picture of a bee enclosed in amber. It's similar to the bee in the specimen of Dominican amber that we have here. Geologists think that both specimens are between 25 and 40 million years old, And now that's a big problem for them because they have now extracted from the abdomen of the bee bacteria, live bacteria. This result supports earlier findings of over 1,000 types of bacteria from other insects, some that date with the dinosaurs. Until now, many evolutionists thought those findings were due to laboratory contamination. They just couldn't believe bacteria could survive for tens or hundreds of millions of years. But this new result, coming after 4 years of careful analysis, rules out laboratory contamination. As a scientist, the reason why I believe the bacteria were found in the bee in the Dominican amber and in other fossils previously of the same age as the dinosaurs is because they're really all quite young. These have to be the result of being encased and buried in a worldwide flood, a catastrophic flood only several thousand years ago. All this agrees with the evidence for the young age of oil and coal that we've already seen, and clearly is consistent with the view that the varied life forms found in nature originated with the supernatural events of Creation Week only about 6,000 years ago.
At this point, many may wonder how this startling summation can be reconciled with the evolutionary view of Earth history. They may ask, do we not know from radiometric dating that Earth's basement rocks, the granites, formed repeatedly at different times and places over billions of years of evolutionary time? And do we not know that using these same methods that the fossils and sedimentary rocks are hundreds of millions of years old?
The answer is a clear-cut no to both questions. Neither granites nor fossils have ages stamped on them when they are collected. The ancient radiometric ages that scientists have accepted for so long have never been scientific facts. Factual scientific information is derived from laboratory experiments. Radiometric age dating is really just an arithmetic calculation. It is composed of a laboratory measurement, the amount of lead divided by the amount of uranium. Both of these are ascertained in the laboratory. The other variable is supposedly a constant. It assumes a constant decay rate. The age is then calculated as the product of that constant times the ratio. Only the ratio is measured in the laboratory. If this constant here is really not a constant but a variable, then the age is meaningless, and the radiometric ages are just so much radiometric fiction.
Evolution assumes granites formed by slow cooling over billions of years. The time of cooling, or presumed age, is obtained by measuring the present radioactive decay products in the granite, and assuming they accumulated only by slow, constant radioactive decay. Because evolution equates radioactive age with the time of cooling, any evidence showing granites formed rapidly essentially shows their simultaneous creation. Thus, the premise of constant radioactive decay and the inference of great age is invalidated.
And indeed, there is scientific evidence for their simultaneous creation. Etched within the granites are beautiful microspheres of coloration produced by the decay of a certain radioactive element known to have only a fleeting existence. Using a simple analogy, Alka-Seltzer bubbles in water can be retained only by rapid freezing. Similarly, the microscopic record of fleeting radioactive decay in the granites is there only because these rocks were instantly created in solid form. If these rocks had formed by slow cooling, as evolution claims, the radioactive traces would have disappeared in the melt without leaving any visible record. This record of instantaneous creation is found in granites worldwide. Moreover, its existence in granites of vastly different radiometric ages shows they were all created at the same time. This collapses the whole foundation of geologic time. The hundreds of millions of years of cooling time that geologists have thought necessary to form the giant monolith El Capitan is reduced to less than a few minutes.
Big Bang cosmology implies, indeed, we have the correct history of the Earth, several billion years, the granites and so forth of the Earth, cooling down over billions of years of time. Here's El Capitan at Yosemite, famous granite. Here's the situation. Suppose that we have something in the rocks today that shows that indeed there's a short half-life type radioactivity that was embedded in the granites. If indeed you don't have anything there, will indicate that, then the rock is going to cool over millions of years to get a solid rock. However, if there's something in the granite itself that would indicate a short half-life and radioactivity was embedded in the granite, then you're going to have basically instant creation. We do have that. I've looked at rocks all over the world, granite rocks all over the world, and what do they have? Have these little circular rings here. This one is produced by the decay of polonium-218. Goes polonium-218, polonium-214, then down to polonium-210. All three alpha decays, the alpha particles go out and discolor the region right around the central speck. So what is interesting here is that the half-life of polonium-218 is only 3 minutes. You've got this embedded in rocks all over the world. Here's a schematic of basically what it looked like and why it's 3 minutes. I'm coming up with a viewpoint then that indeed the God of heaven is actually left in the foundational rocks, indeed proof that indeed you got an instant creation of the granite rocks. Nucleogenesis, polonium halos in the foundation granites limit the period, the time period from the actual origin creation of the granites to the foundation rocks being solid. That was only 3 minutes. Now, we all know, of course, that Steven Weinberg says it's 3 minutes is after several billion years, of course, of the Big Bang. Didn't happen that way. Here we have G. Brent Dalrymple receiving a National Medal of Science from President Bush on 3/14/05. Why do I mention him? Because in 1981 there was a trial, a famous trial, Little Rock, Arkansas, concerning the law that had been passed by the state of Arkansas requiring the teaching of creation science in the public schools. Here is Dalrymple's testimony. In Gentry's work, he proposed a very tiny mystery balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence. It's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. Here's what he says on the witness stand there at the trial. If you have a granitic body, a rock that comes from a melt that contains this mica, mica is this mineral in which the halos are found, it cools down. It takes millions of years for a body like this to cool. That means that's supposedly the origin of the rock there, the old Capitan, so that by the time the body cooled, all the polonium would have decayed. Since it has an extremely short half-life, there would be no polonium in the body to cause the polonium halos. So what Gentry is saying is this is primordial polonium, therefore the granite mass in which it occurs could not have cooled slowly. It had to have been created by fiat. He said on the witness stand. So, what are we going to do after that? The judge actually ruled against the creation law. Why did he do that? Basically because he wanted to show that indeed the actual presence of the radioactive halos in granite rock were not an indication of rapid creation. Very quickly now, the judge, in making a decision about whether this Arkansas law of teaching creation science was valid or not, he says, this is the decision now, he said the 19 Arkansas creation law defined creation science, science that involved, among other things, sudden creation of the universe from nothing. However, when Judge Overton gets to the point of actually rendering his decision, referring to my work, which is the work showing that indeed there was instant creation, Overton says it's been dated. It's been dated. Now, 10 years prior to that time, I was, publishing in Science and Nature over and over and over again the evidence for these primordial radioactive halos. So I wondered how in the world could it be that Judge Overton would say my work was dated when it was all right there before him for the last 10 years, and on the witness stand, Brent Dalrymple says it's a very tiny mystery, and I'll show you. I got a letter in the mail several years now after the trial, and it was concerning a talk given by Frank Tipler, University of New Orleans, cosmologist there, and he says the following. He's now quoting about his paper he gave there at Proceedings of the 1984 Biennial Meeting of the Philosophy of Science Association in East Lansing. Here's what he says. Commenting now on the law and in fact that indeed it involved creation and so forth, I pointed out this contradiction to Judge Overton. This is now Tipler talking, saying he wrote to John Wheeler, saying that indeed this cannot be. If indeed there's something wrong, that you can't just throw out the law itself. And he said that John Wheeler said he would not be able to obey the law if indeed the law was passed and said you could teach creation science. Then he goes on to say the following. When I discussed Judge Overton's opinion at the PSA conference, Philosophy of Science Association conference in 1984, he said the following. Dave Schramm, who was one of the expert witnesses in the Arkansas case, as we all know probably, Dave Schramm was a very, very, very famous cosmologist a number of years ago. Dave Schramm remarked to me, Tipler, that he and other cosmologists in the case were unhappy with this part of Overton's opinion. Schramm, it says, Another collegists tried to convey to the judge that the standard Big Bang theory was also a creationist theory. That means that Dave Schramm and other cosmologists got to the judge. There was collusion between the ACLU expert witnesses and the Judge Overton. One of the greatest cover-ups in the history of science. If I had known that at the time, I would have gone back to the Attorney General of the state of Arkansas, and guess what? They would have filed suit. Fraud, 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 fraud. At the Arkansas creation trial. In other words, the only way that this material I'm telling you this afternoon has escaped notice, public notice, is because of the deception that was practiced there at the Arkansas trial by the ACLU. All right, so here's what happened. Remember, at the trial, Brent Dalrymple said, you know, this business of Gentry, he's got primordial halos. It looks like it's fiat creation, but I don't know for sure. In other words, he didn't convince the judge. Well, the judge was not going to be convinced because, in essence, he was with the ACLU in the trial from the very start of the trial itself. Anyway, this National Center of Science Education letter I have before you here is something that Brent Dalrymple wrote and distributed to every member of the American Geophysical Union, 30,000 or more members. This says 1995, he wrote a similar letter in 1992. What am I bringing this out? Why am I bringing this out? It's because in this letter that Brent Dalrymple wrote, as a fundraising letter, it says the following: the creation science movement is beginning to affect college classes. Members of Genesis Club enter classrooms with disruptive and difficult answering questions. How would you answer a student who claims the presence of polonium? This is now Brent Dalrymple saying in this letter that went out to 30,000 geophysicists, who claims that the presence of polonium halos in granite demonstrate the granite had to have formed suddenly, specially created. He wrote a letter like this in 1992. He was appealing to 30,000 other geoscientists, cosmologists. Help me understand what's going on. These guys in the Genesis clubs are going all over America saying that indeed there's evidence for fiat creation. In other words, I'm telling you something this afternoon that Brent Dalrymple, Medal of Science winner, actually admitted in print twice to 30,000 members of the AGU, and most people don't know anything about it. You're privileged. Throughout the scientific community, they had, in a sense, tolerated me being there at that laboratory saying all these things about the evidence showing that indeed the Earth was formed very, very rapidly, that it's very, very young. A scientist came over from Germany one day and came up to talk to me, and as a result of that, he went back and talked to the chemistry division director. I was in the chemistry division. He went back and told the chemistry division director after he talked to me. He said, you know, if Gentry lived in Russia, he was a German scientist, well known. He said, if Gentry lived in Russia, this is now about 1979 or thereabouts, 78, he would be shot. In other words, if a man such as myself were to go and try to find and publish something in Russia at that particular time, he was saying to the chemistry division director, I would be shot. He said, in Germany, if he were over here doing the work here in Germany, which, you know, I'm the head of a big laboratory myself, if he were here in Germany, he would starve. In other words, nobody, he would not support my work, no one would support my work, regardless of these reports. He said, only here in America, with you, being the chemistry division director, is Gentry able to do the work that he's done and get these papers published. I know what the answer was for me being able to stay there that long. That was the God of heaven intervening to help me use the marvelous facilities of the laboratory and the friendship of the people of the laboratory for a long period of time to get these results out to the world. Well, what happened here at the Arkansas creation trial, it turns out, I'll mark here on the screen, the gentleman, Brent Dalrymple, who was there to testify for an ancient age of the earth. He was one of the world's eminent geologists. He was there to testify and to affirm, you know, ancient earth, so therefore evolution of the earth, evolution of life had to have happened. And that's exactly what he did. And yours truly, of course, at that particular time, I'm down here on the lower right. You can see I'm flashing the light up there. That's where I was, and along with several others who came to testify for creation. But remember we said that Brent Dalrymple was an eminent scientist? David, what happened there in March 2005?
In 2005, we see that Brent Dalrymple was given a National Medal of Science from President Bush. And the reason we show this slide is basically just to try to show people that Britton Dalrymple is somebody that, you know, had made a lot of contributions to science and was recognized by President Bush with this medal. But in the process of making these contributions to science, he also wrote some letters which were used. Are they going to be showing next here?
We'll be showing those later on. Then.
He wrote some letters. We're going to be seeing some of those letters in a minute that actually give an indication of what he feels like is wrong with the Genesis movement, as he calls it.
But right now at the trial, Britton Dalrymple was testifying. Now this is what the judge, the Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General David Williams, Britton Dalrymple was on the witness stand. And he was, for example, like right here. And the judge, Overton, was right here. And he was being cross-examined by David Williams, who was standing almost 5 or 10 feet from Britton Dalrymple, who was sitting in the witness stand. And he was going through a series of questions of Britton Dalrymple, trying to find out exactly more. Britton Dalrymple had already testified about the ancient age of the earth and on and on and on. In fact, he said that people who believed in creation and the young age of the earth were, guess what? They were like flat earthers. In other words, they were really off track. But the Assistant Attorney General, David Williams, got around to asking him about my work. And he said, Dr. Dalrymple, what about Robert Gentry's work? And this is what he had to say. On the witness stand there with a full course of the audience and the judge listening, and also it's in record of the trial itself, and it's copied there in my book if you're ever interested in reading. Go ahead.
Right, it's part of the trial transcript. Basically, Britton Dalrymple's explanation of the polonium halo research, he states this. He says, also in Gentry's work, he proposed a very tiny mystery, which is balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence. Notice the similarity between what the National Academy of Sciences said in its booklet, Science and Creationism. You know, our Frank Press's letter responds to Dad, where he says, I don't see how one piece of data can balance the overwhelming information on the other side. And here, Britton Dalrymple is saying the exact same thing. A tiny mystery balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence, but he does think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. And for most people, I'll just tell you this, most people, the answer to that little mystery is simple. It was formed by some uranium precursor which has, millions of year half-life. That's their answer. That's the only answer they can come up with. And that answer was refuted by the published papers. But anyway, the rest of his thing, he says, he's trying to explain now exactly what is this little mystery. He says, if you have a granitic body, a rock that comes from the melt, that contains this mica, and it cools down, it takes millions of years like that for a body to cool, so that by the time the body cooled, the body of rock is what he's referring to here, all the polonium would have decayed. What happened to the Alka-Seltzer tablet a minute after it was put in the glass? It decays away. All the activity from the tablet is gone. Once it's gone, can you capture the activity of the tablet fizzing in the water? No. Once it's gone, it's gone. The same thing with the polonium halos. So that by the time the body cooled, all the polonium would have decayed, since it has an extremely short half-life of the order of minutes. Therefore, there would be no polonium in the body to cause the polonium halos. So what Gentry is saying, this is primordial polonium. In other words, primordial polonium, not polonium derived from uranium. And that was the subject of all these papers. Therefore, the granite mass in which it occurs could not have cooled slowly. Therefore, it must have been created by fiat instantly. You know, the essence of what really is behind the research on the polonium halos is not that difficult to grasp. What's difficult to grasp is what follows in train if you accept that scientific evidence. And that is basically you can no longer have long ages. You can't have your long ages for the rocks to form. You can't even have your long ages prior to the formation of life. You can't have it. And you know, it kind of makes common sense a little bit, because if you really believe that the 6 days of creation are literally occurred like they are stated in the Bible, it's not hard to accept the fact that God on day one of creation week spoke the earth into existence. Just like on day 4 of creation week, God created the lesser light and the greater light. Oh yeah, He made the stars too. So if you really want to believe that the earth is billions of years old, you've got to also believe that the sun and the moon and the solar system are billions of years old. But that all flies in the face to the plain word of the Bible. To say then that, well, somehow there was a shroud, which was covering the moon and covering the sun, takes away from the literal wording of the verse when it says He made two great lights, the lesser light to rule the night, the greater light to rule the day. You can also go into the Greek and try to look at the origins of the words, but to me, it makes sense in English. I mean, I can read it in English and I can figure out what's going on. I can read the fourth commandment in English, and it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Revelation 14, worship Him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. It's very simple. God wants to draw our attention to the fact that He is the Creator. If we take away any of that, we're diluting what the plain word of the Bible is saying, period. Why do we want to do that?
David, let's ask this question. This man is an eminent geologist, world-renowned and so forth, and there he is testifying that, and there's a room full of reporters and everything. They got some coverage, but for all practical purposes, the people who were there, the writers and so forth, the reporters who were there, minimized the fact that indeed this evidence was being presented there. Something in the rock that formed very, very quickly. You had to have something around it to catch the radiation instantaneously, or else you don't get anything. And yet the reporters that were there, with few exceptions, said almost nothing about this evidence. Now, here it is. For example, see, the evolutionary view is simply that indeed you've got the granite foundation, you've got a molten earth and so forth, and so the granites are forming deep in the earth and slowly cooling. But what we've just seen is a comparison now. Up top, the top part of our schematic up there, is that if we have radioactive decay plus slowly cooling molten granite, then indeed, radioactive decay meaning the rapid radioactive decay, slowly cooling granite, there are no halos. Nothing is going to be caught in the granite because it's all gone long before the rock actually formed into a solid. The second one, the second illustration, radioactive decay, rapid radioactive decay, instantly created cold granite. It's just like a Polaroid. I could be up here tonight with a Polaroid camera, if they're still used these days, and we push the shutter, push the button, of course. The flash flashes light, and indeed it goes to the audience, comes back. Now, the shutter has got to be synchronized with that flash of light so that it opens and closes instantly, or at the same time, synchronized for it to come back and go back to the film. The film now records the object, the image of the light. Now, the film then is like the granite. The granite has to be there in a form so that it can capture the radiation. The radiation itself would be like the flash of light going out and coming back through the open shutter. There has to be a synchronization of the creation of the little tiny speck of radioactivity for that polonium halo. Has to be there along with the creation of what's around it, the granite rock. Has to be done all together, has to be done instantaneously, or it's all over in just a very, very, very short period of time. The very fact of the matter is, the reason why you haven't heard of all this before, for all practical purposes, most of you, is because, look at this. Tested theories, go ahead, David.
Tested theories of science such as mechanics, electromagnetism, optics and light, nuclear physics and thermodynamics have all had their central assumptions validated experimentally in the laboratory thousands of times. False scientific theories are built upon central assumptions which have never been validated. They can masquerade for decades and even centuries before their falsities discovered.
This one was started by an isotope of polonium with only that 3-minute half-life. And I want to pick up on what David just said. There are people who continue to say, well, no, they're not really primordial, made in the beginning, and so forth. And so, over 30 years ago, I published to the entire scientific community. I challenged them. I simply said, if you don't believe that these halos indeed were formed by God supernaturally, the only option is they had to form naturally. You have all the ingredients to go back and try to form these halos in the granites to reproduce them. I've challenged them over and over and over again for 30 years to say, if you don't believe this evidence for creation is really of God, then you should be able to reproduce it. Oh, no. They don't want to hear that. You will never find the evolutionists even mentioning the fact that they fail to actually do the very fundamental thing that science requires. If they believe a theory, and they have all the material, of course, to try to duplicate it, they should be able to do it. We're going to get into that a little bit later on, more specifically, so you'll have a better idea. Right now, as David has pointed out so clearly here, we're saying that these halos are primordial. Now, whatever, in other words, this little illustration right here, at the top we have a glass of water, we put in Alka-Seltzer, and after a minute or so, it's gone, okay? But down at the bottom, you put in the Alka-Seltzer, and if you instantly freeze the water when the bubbles are coming out, then of course the bubbles are going to be in the glass. And also the bubbles are going to be there after 100 years. In other words, for the actual radioactive particles to shoot out and have a record there in the granite rock, it has to be what? Formed simultaneously with the injection of the radioactivity in the rock. It's simply bing, 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 bing. And it's all along. Now look at this next slide. What is it? Good old El Capitan again. We're saying that these halos are in El Capitan. And so we go from there to, David?
Again,
what are the implications?
We're going back to what the Bible says, that the word of the Lord was used to speak the earth into existence. All the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake and it was done, he commanded and it stood forth. And there's really no other way to say it.
And he actually then decided for us living here today and for those in the last days who are in any way doubting the Genesis record of creation in Psalm 33, 6 and 9, he left something here to affirm scientifically what he said. That's all there is to it. Back in 1981, after I had been at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for over 10 years as a guest scientist, publishing papers on what we're talking about tonight, bringing out to the scientific community the evidence for creation, and virtually getting no refutation. The laboratory was letting me remain year after year and year after year because I was publishing these papers. Not because I was publishing the papers per se, but because the papers were being published and the personnel at the laboratory could see there was no refutation. They could see these articles were being published in the world's esteemed scientific journals, and there were no evolutionists that were being able to shoot the evidence down. So I went to this trial, and over here on the left-hand corner you can see the people who came to the trial, the scientists who came to the trial for the evolutionist position, and on the right, the scientists who came to the trial for creation. What happened is, earlier, in the early part of 1981, the state of Arkansas had passed a law requiring the teaching of creation science in the public schools. The ACLU challenged that law, and I was asked to come and testify about the scientific evidence that I had been publishing. Well, my wife and I prayed about it, and if something happened to indicate that's exactly what I should do, I should go and testify. I realized, however, that in doing this, it was going to go out not just to the scientific community now, it was going out to the world. And I had a pretty good idea that the laboratory management was going to take a very dim view because...
How does this creation evidence impact on the age of the earth? Very significantly. Simultaneous creation of different granites tells us that the various radiometric ages are in error. Something is wrong. Earlier we found there was only one uncertainty in radiometric age calculations. That uncertainty was the assumption of a uniform decay rate. Now we know that there was a change in the decay rate sometime in the past. My view is that indeed at the time of the flood there was a vast change, an increase in the radiometric decay rate. Radioactivity then cannot be used for age dating until after the end of the decay rate change. Any effort to use radioactivity for age dating prior to that time is certainly to end with an erroneous result. Other evidence relating to the decay rate change and a young age of the Earth comes from my studies of granite cores taken from a deep drill hole in New Mexico. In the 1970s, the Department of Energy drilled a deep hole down to around 14,000 feet for the purpose of seeing whether they could extract energy from heat deep in the Earth. I obtained samples from depths of 3,148 feet down to over 14,000 feet. The purpose was to extract tiny microscopic zircons, uranium-bearing minerals, from the granites. The results of my investigations on these zircons were published in Geophysical Research Letters in 1982. The orange half circles here represent the tiny zircons in the granites at different depths. The first one at 3,148 feet at a temperature of 105 degrees centigrade. Going on down to a depth of 14,131 feet at a temperature of 313 degrees centigrade, 3 times the boiling point of water. Now let's assume that these zircons were filled with helium at a given time. The dots above the zircons represent how rapidly the zircons are losing helium at these various depths. Obviously, the hottest one at the greatest depth is going to lose it far more rapidly than the one at the highest depth at 3,148 feet. After a period of time has elapsed, we would expect that indeed the zircon at nearest the surface, 3,148 feet, would still have the greater amount of helium in it. The one at the very lowest depth, at the highest temperature, would now have the smaller amount of helium, very small. This last chart shows the actual experimental results, that we haven't found any helium whatsoever in the zircons at the greatest depths. We did find some at the first 3 depths, down to 197 degrees centigrade. Let's stop just for a moment and see if we can understand what was going on. Helium was being generated as uranium was decaying in these zircons. So the amount of helium in these zircons at various depths tells us something about the time at which the granite has been in existence at this particular temperature. The actual physical experimental results are shown now in the next chart. They're only meaningful as we make a comparison between what we would expect to find if indeed the Earth was 4.5 billion years old. On the left we see the amount expected if the Earth was 4.5 billion years old. Only a very, very small amount. What we have pictured here is really a guesstimate, an approximation. There's so many variables relating to something supposedly that far back that we can't be very, very precise. We do know, however, it would only be a very, very small amount because helium, this decay product of uranium, escapes very rapidly the higher the temperature is. What we actually found, however, in the experiments was helium in the zircons diminishing, 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 but still there at a temperature of 197 degrees centigrade. The weight of the scientific evidence has brought us to the collapse of evolutionary time. There is a young Earth creation time scale. The radiometric ages of the granites, stretching from 80 million to 4 billion years, is invalid. These granites, from Yosemite to the basement rocks of the Grand Canyon, to Japan and India, to the granites of Europe and Russia and Canada, were all the product of a simultaneous creation. We haven't proved that the Earth is 6,000 years old, but we have found evidence that is consistent with a 6,000 year age of the Earth. And we have shown that a several billion year age of the Earth is scientifically incorrect.
We've captured only a brief glimpse of the various lines of scientific evidence that point to the truth and accuracy of the biblical record of Earth's recent creation and the Great Flood. Brief though our glimpse has been, the conclusion has been certain. The radioactive traces in coalified wood collapse the geological timescale for life on Earth from hundreds of millions of years to just thousands. The occurrence of the worldwide flood explains the rapid accumulation of vegetation responsible for Earth's vast coal and oil reserves. The young age of coal and its rapid formation in the laboratory, as well as the oil now forming in Guaymas Basin off the California coast, fits only into a young, not ancient, age of the Earth. Dinosaurs, their fossils buried in mass graveyards, and their tracks in coal are a mute reminder of the futile attempts of these creatures to escape the rising waters of a worldwide flood. The excess helium in deep granites provides concrete evidence the Earth's crustal rocks are young, thus powerfully disproving the whole concept of an anciently evolving Earth. And finally, the fingerprints of creation, also found in the granites, the very rocks the Bible speaks of as Earth's foundation rocks, confirm these rocks were all the product of the same creation. This fact invalidates evolution's basic assumption of uniform radioactive decay and collapses the whole structure of evolutionary time. We must conclude, therefore, that evolution's 4.5 billion year age of the Earth is nothing more than science fiction. Prior to viewing this evidence, perhaps few would have believed that the granite monoliths of Yosemite were part of Earth's creation about 6,000 years ago. This is somewhat understandable, seeing that we live in a secular world dominated by the belief that science supports the evolutionary view of an ancient Earth. But now that this evidence for creation and a young Earth has exposed evolution's fundamental flaw, we realize there has always been a bridge connecting science with biblical creation. Why didn't we recognize it sooner? It seems we were blinded by the idea we could explain all of Earth history by the natural laws that we now experience. We forgot that God's infinite creative power is far above our limited understanding of the universe and the laws which govern it. So things that fitted into evolution were emphasized, so much so that it seemed natural law really did explain everything. The hard things that couldn't be explained were put on the back burner. We tended to forget them, thinking they would someday be solved. What we failed to admit to ourselves is that many of those hard things were really impossible to explain within the framework of evolution, that they were actually evidence for either creation or a worldwide flood. The evidence presented has given us reason to rethink our beliefs about origins based on valid scientific data. Clearly, the belief system that fits all the scientific facts we presented is the record of creation given in Genesis and repeated by Moses in Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day.